Imagine for a moment that you possess a magic machine in your basement. Every time you need a new car, barrels of oil, or the latest technology, you simply press a button. The machine spits out green pieces of paper, and your neighbors, who toil in factories and fields all day, gladly accept them in exchange for their hard work. You consume, they produce. You print, they save. It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But for the last 80 years, this has been the reality of the United States. It is what economists call the exorbitant privilege. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the US dollar has sat on the global throne, reigning as the undisputed king of currencies. But history is a cruel timekeeper, and it plays favorites with no one. If we look back through the centuries, studying the rise and fall of the Dutch Empire or the British Empire, a chilling pattern emerges. Just like a human life, every economic superpower goes through a biological cycle: birth, growth, maturity, and decline. Historians have calculated the average lifespan of this dominance. It almost always falls within a specific window, 80 to 100 years. Now, let's look at the clock. The US dollar was crowned in 1944. That was 81 years ago. Mathematically, the American empire has already drifted past the average expiration date of a superpower. We are no longer in the era of youthful growth. We are living on borrowed time. The king is old, his movements are slower, and the privileges that once seemed eternal are beginning to look like the symptoms of a terminal illness. The question is no longer if the reign will end. The terrifying question staring us in the face is, has the clock already struck midnight and we just haven't heard the chime yet? If the timeline suggests the king is weary, the signs suggest he is fragile. To understand the gravity of the US dollar's condition, we do not need a crystal ball. We simply need to look into the rearview mirror of history. The archives of time are filled with former kings, and if you examine why they fell from power, they all succumbed to the same three specific structural failures. The unsettling truth is that the United States is currently displaying clear signs of all three. The first fracture: the Spanish illusion, the trap of easy comfort. Let us travel back to the 16th century. The Spanish Empire was the master of the world. Ships heavy with gold and silver from the Americas flooded into Spanish ports. They were awash in liquidity. But this abundance birthed a profound psychological error: the illusion of prosperity. Because they possessed so much currency, the Spanish stopped creating value. Why toil in the fields or sweat in factories when you can simply buy whatever you want from the British, the French, or the Dutch? They became a nation of wealthy consumers, abandoning their role as producers. Fast forward to the United States today. Walk into a Walmart in Ohio or browse Amazon in New York. Look at the labels: made in China, made in Vietnam, made in Mexico. Like Spain, the US fell into the trap of outsourcing its strength. The American economy shifted from being the workshop of the world to the banker of the world. The industrial heartland, the engine that powered the 20th century, has gone quiet, replaced by financial engineering and service industries. When a country forgets how to build, it becomes dependent on those who do. Spain realized too late that gold cannot be eaten. The US is now realizing that you cannot print a microchip or a tank hull during a supply chain crisis. The ability to print money is a superpower, but it is also a sedative that lulls a nation into industrial slumber. The second fracture: the British burden, the weight of obligation. The second lesson comes from the early 20th century: the British Empire. For 100 years, the pound sterling was the standard of stability, but maintaining a global empire is costly. Britain began to spend far beyond its means. It borrowed to fight conflicts, borrowed to maintain colonies, and borrowed to keep its social programs running. By the time the 1940s arrived, the empire on which the sun never sets was financially underwater. They were not overcome by an opposing army. They were overwhelmed by their own balance sheet. In 1944, exhausted and overextended, they were forced to hand the crown to the US dollar. Today, the US has surpassed the British level of entanglement. The numbers are so large they defy imagination. $36 trillion in debt. But the total number isn't the most critical part. The real anchor dragging the ship down is the interest. Imagine a family that earns $50,000 a year but has to pay $20,000 just to service the interest on their credit cards. They haven't even touched the principal loan yet. They are just paying to keep the bank from calling. That is America today. For the first time in history, the U.S. government is allocating more funds to interest payments for bondholders than it allocates to its entire national defense. When the cost of your past choices exceeds the budget for your future security, the path forward disappears. This is not a policy debate. It is an arithmetic reality. The U.S. is borrowing new money just to pay off old creditors, a cycle that, in the private sector, is unsustainable. The third fracture. The French divide, the internal erosion. The final fracture is the most damaging because it erodes the soul of a nation. It is the dynamic that toppled the French monarchy in 1789 and the Russian czars in 1917. It is the breaking of the social contract. A superpower rarely fades solely because of external challengers. It fades because the people inside stop believing in it. In the twilight years of every great power, there is always a massive, undeniable gap between the elites and the masses. In late-stage France, the aristocracy lived in luxury at Versailles, while the common people struggled for bread. In modern America, the top 0.1% control as much wealth as the bottom 90%. The stock market hits record highs, while the average family struggles to afford groceries. This economic polarization creates deep social rifts. It turns neighbors into rivals. It creates a political environment where compromise is impossible. When the population feels the system is rigged, that the king's money only enriches the king's inner circle, faith in the currency evaporates. And remember, money is nothing but faith. It is a shared story. When the people lose faith in the fairness of the system, they eventually lose faith in the currency that powers it. So here we stand. The United States is exhibiting the industrial lethargy of Spain, the suffocating debt of Britain, and the social division of Bourbon France. Any one of these fractures can destabilize an empire. The U.S. has all three simultaneously. The king is not just old, he is structurally unsound, kept upright by the momentum of the past and the lack of a better alternative. But as we will see in the next chapter, the world is starting to notice the king is stumbling, and the challengers are beginning to make their move. Identifying the fractures is only the beginning. The true drama lies in how the system attempts to survive them. We have moved beyond the warnings of history and are now witnessing the real-time erosion of the current order. The United States, burdened by the heavy weight of its own debt and division, has drifted into a specific, perilous coordinate on the map of imperial decline. Economists call this the print-to-sustain phase. Because the debt burden has grown so heavy, the United States faces a binary choice: either default on its promises, tell the world we cannot pay, or create new money out of thin air to cover the bills. They have chosen the latter. Imagine you are at a grand banquet where the host is serving a fine, rare vintage wine. Halfway through the night, the casks run low. Instead of admitting the supply is finished, the host begins adding water to the bottles. At first, the guests barely notice, but as he adds more water, the taste fades. The vintage loses its character. This is exactly what is happening to the US dollar. To patch up the cracks in the foundation, the Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars. But by doing so, the king is watering down the currency. This results in inflation. But we must correct a common misunderstanding. Inflation is not merely rising prices. That is a dangerous simplification. Inflation is the erosion of your time. If you worked 10 hours to buy a standard basket of goods in 2020, and today you must work 14 hours for the exact same basket, the system has quietly erased 4 hours of your labor. It is a silent transfer of wealth from the savers, the people, to the debtors, the government. While citizens feel the sting of this dilution, the rest of the world sees the signal. This leads us to the second major reality of our time: the quiet exit. For decades, holding U.S. Treasury bonds was considered the safest investment in the world. It was the bedrock of global finance. But trust is fragile. As the world watches the U.S. dilute its currency to pay its debts, and as they observe the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions, other nations are becoming uneasy. They are not declaring open conflict. They are simply diversifying their portfolios. This is the phenomenon often called de-dollarization. It is not a dramatic explosion, but a steady, calculated shift. We see this in the expansion of the BRICS alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new partners. These nations are actively building payment systems that bypass the dollar, trading oil and goods in their own local currencies. But the most telling signal comes from what they are buying instead. Global central banks are currently accumulating gold at a pace not seen in over half a century. Why gold? Because gold is the only asset that is not someone else's liability. You cannot print gold. It is the ancient anchor of value. When central banks trade U.S. bonds for gold, they are essentially voting with their wallets. They are saying, "We prefer a tangible asset over a currency that is being diluted." So this is where we stand. The exorbitant privilege is being challenged by the exorbitant burden of debt. The world is transitioning from a unipolar system, where the U.S. is the only sun in the sky, to a multipolar system, where several suns exert their own gravity. The U.S. dollar is not vanishing overnight, but its monopoly is fracturing. The king is no longer the only game in town, and the players are starting to look for other tables. However, before we write the final conclusion of this empire, we must pause. Is the decline truly guaranteed? Or does the king still have an ace up his sleeve? As we move forward, we must challenge our own assumptions, because betting against America has historically been a very dangerous wager. It is tempting to look at the mounting debt, the social fractures, and the rising competitors, and declare that the funeral is tomorrow. The narrative of inevitable collapse is seductive. It offers a simple ending to a complex story. But if history teaches us that empires die, it also teaches us that they fight to stay alive. And the United States is not just any empire. It is a beast with survival instincts sharper than any the world has ever seen. Before we write the obituary for the dollar, we must confront the uncomfortable reality of why, despite all the sickness we just described, the patient is still the strongest man in the room. In the world of finance, there is a famous acronym: TINA. There is no alternative. Money is like water. It has to flow somewhere. If investors flee the US dollar, where do they go? Do they go to the euro? Europe is a fragmented collection of nations often bickering over policy, burdened by low growth and energy insecurity. Do they go to the Chinese yuan? China faces a catastrophic demographic collapse and maintains strict capital controls. You can check into the yuan, but you can't always check out. Do they go to the Japanese yen? Japan's population is shrinking, and its central bank owns more than half of the country's government bond market. This creates a paradox known as the ugly contest. The US dollar does not need to be perfect. It simply needs to be better than the alternatives. In a global economy that looks like a hamper of dirty laundry, the US dollar remains the cleanest shirt. It is flawed, stained, and fraying, but compared to the others, it is still the only one you can wear to a business meeting. Furthermore, a currency is backed by more than just the promises of a central bank. It is backed by the tangible power of the nation that issues it, and the United States possesses advantages that the Dutch, Spanish, and British never had. First, look at the geography. The US is a continental fortress, flanked by 2 massive oceans and 2 friendly neighbors. While Europe and Asia are crowded geopolitical chessboards prone to conflict, North America is a secure island of stability. Second, look at the energy. Unlike the empires of old that relied on colonies for resources, the U.S. is energy independent. It is the world's largest producer of oil and gas. It does not need to beg for fuel, it sells it. Third, and perhaps most importantly, is innovation. We are standing on the precipice of the AI revolution. Where is this revolution happening? It is not in London, Frankfurt, or Tokyo. It is in Silicon Valley. The immense value being created by American technology companies acts as a massive magnet for global capital. As long as the U.S. remains the incubator of the future, the world will need dollars to buy a piece of it. So, does this mean the king is immortal? No. It means our definition of collapse is likely wrong. We have been conditioned by Hollywood to think of collapse as an explosion, a sudden event where the stock market goes to zero, the lights go out, and society descends into chaos overnight. But history rarely works like a movie script. The fall of Rome took centuries. It wasn't a cliff. It was a long, gentle slope. The death of the dollar likely won't mean it disappears. It means a transition from monopoly to oligopoly. For the last 80 years, we lived in a unipolar world, one where the US dollar was the sun, and every other nation was a planet orbiting it. The US could sanction anyone, print anything, and dictate the rules. We are now moving toward a multipolar world. In this new reality, the dollar is still a major power, perhaps even the biggest one, but it is no longer the only one. It will have to share the table with gold, with commodities, and perhaps with a basket of rival currencies. The king isn't being executed. He is being forced to form a parliament. The exorbitant privilege is fading into a standard negotiation. This nuance is critical. The U.S. empire isn't vanishing, but its ability to dictate terms to the rest of the planet is ending. The giant is still standing, but he is no longer standing alone. And this brings us to the final verdict. If the collapse is a process rather than an event, what does that mean for us, the individuals living through this great transition? How do we prepare for a world where the rules of money are being rewritten? We have traveled a long road together. From the dusty archives of the Spanish Empire to the cold algorithms of Silicon Valley, we have dissected the anatomy of the aging king and peered into the deep fractures running through his bones. So, what is the final lesson etched into the stone of history? There is a brutal truth that the past whispers to every superpower, yet few ever stop to listen. Empires are rarely murdered. They commit suicide. Rome did not fall simply because the barbarians breached the gates. Rome fell because it had hollowed itself out from the inside, through decadence, currency debasement, and the severance of the bond between the ruler and the ruled. long before the first enemy soldier set foot in the city. Today, the United States possesses the most formidable military machine the planet has ever known. It can deploy aircraft carriers to any ocean within 24 hours. But there are two forces that no fleet of destroyers, no hypersonic missile, and no special forces team can defeat: mathematics and trust. You cannot launch an airstrike against compound interest. You cannot force inflation to surrender with a treaty. You cannot mandate the world to trust a green piece of paper when you are actively diluting its value every single day. The final battle for the US dollar is not being fought on the battlefields of Ukraine or the waters of the South China Sea. It is being fought on the balance sheet. And in the war between politics and mathematics, mathematics always wins. It is cold, it is unemotional, and it is undefeated. But this is not a tragedy. It is simply gravity. The end of an old order does not mean the end of the world. As the sun sets on this empire, it will rise on a different horizon. The collapse of the unipolar moment is simply the world returning to its natural state of balance, a multipolar reality. The message for us, the individuals living through this great turning of the tide, is not one of fear, but of awareness. Do not gamble your future on the assumption that tomorrow will look exactly like today. The safety net of the last 40 years, the certainty of paper money and government bonds, is fraying. The rules of the game are being rewritten while we play. View this change not as a disaster, but as a season. Winter comes, the old trees fall, and the forest clears space for new growth. The question of the dollar losing its crown is no longer if, but when. And when that moment of transition arrives, the winners will not be the strongest, but the most adaptable. They will be the ones who understand that true wealth isn't found in the numbers printed on paper, but in real assets, real skills, and independent thinking. The king is slowly walking into the shadows of history. Do not cling to his robes. Instead, pack your bags and prepare to greet the dawn of a new world order. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the times. Because when history is written, you'll want to be among the few who recognized what was coming early. Thank you for watching and being part of the journey.